I'm going to kind of start with the PO process. It shouldn't change too much. So you're going to create, if you were to use the container module, you would create POs like you normally do. The only difference that we're adding is a couple new fields. So I'm going to go to a new PO and kind of do that process. So I've created a couple dummy vendors. So I'm going to use overseas vendor 2. And so these are the 2 fields that I'm going to highlight, actually 4 fields. These 2 are probably more important to add onto the purchase order because we do have logic that kind of feeds the item receipt once we do the receiving. These 2 are kind of more optional. It depends on your practice. So in a other client, it was 1 PO and they usually would receive it in full and they would put it on a container. I think when I'm looking in your environment, it looks like you guys do 1 PO, you might have some partial shipment. So 1 PO can go on multiple containers. So here I'm creating this. I know this could be coming from, I'm just going to use this dummy one. So overseas consolidation warehouse, you can have many of these. So in another implementation, we had a France warehouse, an Italy warehouse, but I'm just picking this one. It's a dummy one I created just to kind of show you that you would receive it in kind of an overseas location. It's like a new location. And then you would put your location destination on where you would actually finally stock it. So I just created a dummy location called Final Stock Warehouse. So I'm going to pause here. Does anyone have any questions on kind of these new fields that are on the purchase order for the freight container module? So I'm just going to go ahead and add items. And I'll add one more item. Okay, and hit save. Okay, so these would, be the purchase orders you submitted to your vendors. And when it's time to pick up the wine, based on the other wine company we did this for, they would usually kind of understand what POs are going on what container. So they would have already created a container record. So the next step before you receive like the POs, because and I don't know if that's true for you guys, like before you receive the POs, do you know what container it's going to go on? Or do you?
At the time of PO submission, our buyers are submitting those. So no, generally
Okay.
they
Not
would
on
not.
not on
No.
submission. What about when you're about to receive them or pick them up from the vendor?
Yeah.
You do.
Yeah, it would have
Okay.
been planned. Yeah,
Okay. So that's
far.
usually the case with the other implementation we did. So, you're probably having your planning sheet maybe on the side, but what you could also do is, you could try to use NetSuite. I know clients like to do a lot of things in Excel, but what you would do is once you have that plan, so you would come to a menu where you would get the container records and you'd hit new. And so what you would be doing here is entering in the container information. Again, there's a lot of fields in here. You may not be using all of them. In the implementations that we've done, we've kind of hidden and taken out some of them, but these are the fields throughout the years that have been added based on client requirements. The bare minimum ones are the ones that you'd see with the red asterisk, which means it's required. So I'm just going to enter in a container name, and this would probably be the name that you get from your logistics company. Okay. Again, all of the other ones are optional. The status is a mandatory field. And so this one will always start at origin port, but I'm just going to show you the different options here. So at origin port, we could also rename the status, but this would be at origin port or planned or something like that, right? The next status is on sea in transit. And this really does, and I'm going to walk through this, but I just want to say it now and then I'll repeat it again as we go through the process. The on sea in transit one is when you actually say the container is set sailed. It does create kind of transactional records that impact, the accounting books. These next 4 are really just informational. So it depends on what level you want to track. So some clients have just used this one, and the last one. Other clients might want to know when it's at the landing port. Some of them use this. So again, the 3 that are important are at origin port, on sea, in transit, and received at destination. And then these are just for tracking statuses. There's no financial or transactional records created or impact when you change it to these statuses. Okay, so I'm going to leave that there. Ownership, it really is here because it deals with when you do transfer orders. NetSuite has this thing called Incoterm. So this is just a table that we have. So you can say, okay, it's FOB and it links to, maybe EXW, XWorks, or it could be DAP or another one, but it's just a way for us to tag the transfer order with the correct Incoterm, because I think that's one of the requirement fields in NetSuite when you do a transfer. Bill of lading, some people use this, some people rename it, or we've created another field for shipment number. I think this would be the field that you would use to kind of help keep all your documents together, because usually there's a shipment number or bill of lading number that you'll see on your bills, you'll see on your, your documentation on what's sailing and whatnot. Again, this is another field if you wanted to put the factory invoice. I think this is used more for when we did implementation for things that were built in China and then moved over. So they wanted to put the invoice number. Number of cartons, that's another thing if you're the way it's packaged is a little bit differently. Shipment type, again, this is all informational. So we have this here. So if you want to know, okay, this is ocean LCL or ocean FCL, same with ground and air. And then notes, just any notes you wanted to add. So if you came back to this record, you could read them and it would be relevant to it. This one I'm not going to go over too much. These are all calculated once you add items to the container. This one was our first stab at getting freight landed cost in. It's not really used today because I think our landed cost bundles have kind of taken over some of the features here. And this section is important because this will give you information about where the container is coming from. So here I'm going to say, okay, it's coming from this overseas consolidation warehouse. The sailing date's important. So this is the date where it's going to be marked in transit, and then it's going to set sail. And that means from an accounting perspective, which I'll show you, is that the items are now in transit. So I'm going to just put a sailing date of here. And then location destination is important. It's where you're going to receive it, and that's where the inventory is going to be increased in this final location. Okay. I'm going to pause there and then I'll go over the dates. There's a lot of information here. Do you guys have any questions around this record? Again, we simplify it based on the client. This is just a dump of all the fields that we've used throughout the years.
Is the status just like a custom list?
It is a custom list, yes. But there's logic driven off of 3 statuses. So
Right.
just the 3 that I mentioned: at origin port, on sea transit, and received at destination location. But it is just a custom list, yes. Okay. I didn't go over all of this stuff. I just want to pause. Any other questions? I'll finish going over the destination part. There's no other questions.
Sorry, I maybe it's down below, but do you add in the orders to this container from this section?
Not this way, but I'll show you how it's done. So
Okay.
you would first kind of create your container, and then I'll show you how you would add kind of the orders in after you create it. Okay. So the other thing that's important to fill out is probably the date fields. I'm going to go over here since I want to make sure I cover all the fields. If you wanted to use the vessel, you could. It's just a way of grouping multiple containers that might be coming on a vessel. It's used in some implementations, and others they don't use it. So this is just a way of, because on the vessel, if you had multiple containers on the same vessel, you could interact with them, and you could change the date arrival. I'll show you that. I don't know if you're doing that today. If that's something that you want to use in the future, I can show you that at a later time.
We do currently, track all of our vessels as well.
Okay. So you could use it, but I think with the inbound shipment, are you thinking are you grouping inbound shipments and knowing oh, these 3 inbound shipments are on vessels, or is it just for information to know that it's on that vessel?
So from the information that we get from our forwarder, I just put in what vessel
Got it.
it's on, and then when I export a document, I can then just sort by vessel type, and then is from that.
Okay, so I mean, this might be useful. We could look at it if you guys are interested in the module. We can look at how that would play out. But what it would do is you would create another record, which is a parent record, and then basically you could add multiple containers here, so you could track it that way. Or based on what you're doing today, we could create not a relational field. We could just create a regular field that you could populate with information. It just depends on how you want to report on it, and if you want that kind of parent-child hierarchy. That's kind of what it's used for, is it kind of helps relate them. And let me just show you, because it's probably better if I just do, I'll just add a vessel to this because it'll probably make more sense. So let's just call this vessel 1, and let's just change the date here. Again, this is all out of the box kind of forms. So what will happen here, I forgot to add the date. So if you do a vessel, usually if you're going to do vessel, you create the vessel for. So what happens, we have logic, where if you sign a vessel, this container inherits everything from the vessel. So I think what I needed to do here was populate all of the location fields. So it has like the similar information as the container. And then, sorry, I'm going to go back and I'm going to add some dates just so you can see. So I can say, like, I think we're going to get it on the 10th. So there's a couple dates here. There's the date you think the vessel's going to land at the port. And then there's a date where you think it's going to be received. So let me go show you here. It kind of shows you, actually, I thought I attached that. Let me double check. Okay, let me go back to that container. Oh, I didn't save it yet. So let me just re-add this vessel to it. I haven't saved this one yet. That's why it's not on there. So if you see how when I changed it, it took this date. Normally with the vessel, it should copy over whatever's on the vessel over here, and then it should copy the sailing date. And then I thought it would copy over the receive date, but it didn't. So I'll have to check on that. The carrier is another field. I don't know if that's something you use today. There's a tracking URL. I don't know if any of these have it, but basically the tracking URL is just a URL that's tied to this carrier table, and it just fills in with the site for that carrier. And then here are the dates. So for each set of dates, we have an estimated date and an actual date. So you can kind of say, okay, well, I think it's going to land on, I'm just going to pick dates close together, 5/8. And then if you wanted to track forwarding, you could say, oh, I think it's, the forwarding date estimate might be also the same date. When do you think it's going to arrive at the warehouse? Well, maybe it will take a day or two. So then that's 5/9. And then the date destination. And of course, these would probably be more similar to your scenarios, which might be like 2 or 3 weeks out. So you could fill in all these dates. It's really up to what you guys want to track. The most important dates are the sailing date and the date destination estimate, because that will help you understand when you think it's going to, when it ships, and also when you think it's going to become stock. All these other dates are just more informational. And even when you do the actuals for these dates, it's really just informational for you guys to track and report on. These are not really mandatory. I would say these bottom two are the most important. This date destination estimate calculated was for people who wanted to not have to fill in the date destination estimate, and they just wanted to populate this based on like what port it was coming from. So we have a table that lists the ports, and it says, okay, from that port, it takes, maybe 2 weeks. And so it automatically would add 2 weeks to this date and populate this field here. And then the bin is if you use bins and you need to receive in a bin, that's just on the containers. So you can specify where this bin's going. It could just be, it depends on your implementation. I don't know if you put it all in one bin or the other one, you may or may not use this one, but we'd have to look at how you're using bins today. Okay, so just to kind of reiterate, you had your purchase orders already submitted to your vendor. Now you know that they're going to be picked up, and you already planned a container, and you planned which ones you're going to pick up. So once you pick things up from your vendor or your grower, this is where you would kind of link the purchase orders to the container. And it is done by the process of receiving the container. So I'm going to show you that. So here's the purchase order I created. I'm not going to fill out the container here. You could if this whole purchase order was going on the new container we created, but based on some of the records I saw in your environment, I felt like you did partials. So I'm just going to go ahead and hit the receive button. And I am going to fill in the container number here. And then the ownership, you do need, I need to probably put an asterisk on it. You do need it because it's used for the Incoterm. So this one, I'll probably put a required field. I don't think we've made it required, but it probably should be in our implementation because it's used. I'll show you for the transfer order. That's the underlying record around the freight container. And then what I'll do here is I'll come in and maybe I'm only receiving 50 of these and I'm receiving 40 of these. Okay, so then I'll hit save, and I'll just show you something that some logic that fires once I hit save. Actually, it might be okay. I should have maybe made the date a little later. So I just want to show you, we have the date logic on the item receipt. We normally wouldn't impact anything, but I think sometimes you might receive the PO and just let the date default. So we have logic here. If you try to save, and like I try to save with a later date, I get a warning. It won't let me save because it wants to make sure that I've received this PO before the container sails. And it just deals with just making sure like the item flows correctly, because you need to receive it, put it in the overseas warehouse before you can put it in a container to move it from the overseas warehouse to the final stock warehouse. Okay, so that, Hayden, is a process to get things on a container. What will happen is you just receive the purchase order, you specify the container. If you now go into the container record, it usually, if it's thinking, you'll have a message saying like it's processing. And what that does once you receive an item receipt is it creates a transfer order. So you'll see now you have items on your container where you didn't before. I'm sorry, I didn't go over that section. So anytime you receive a purchase order, you'll see the linkages below. You'll see what item receipts and POs are related to it. And then the record that Hayden, you probably won't really deal with too much because most of the action is going to be on the container. But from a technical and transactional perspective, it's the transfer order that's kind of the posting record that deals with all the movements and all the inventory increases and decreases. So I'm going to actually receive another one just to show you. So just to kind of get us back on the same page, I have one item receipt from this PO, and I've received items A and B. So now I'm going to go to another purchase order, which is the 5-7 that I think I just created, and that's items C and D. I'm going to go ahead and receive this also on this container. Again, this list just has everything that's at origin port, I believe, or maybe we didn't filter it, but this list can be pared down. So you're not seeing all of the ones, only ones that are available to sale. And then James, from a technical perspective, anytime you edit and save a purchase order, it tries to like recalculate the container if there's a container link. And it does it in like a background queue. So it's not where it's holding up the record, it sends it to a queue, and then a job runs and picks up things from the queue. That way it's more asynchronous versus serial. Okay, so now if I look at this container, I should have 4 items in it, which I do. And then if I look at my item receipts, I can see like, okay, I have item A and we're item B, and you can see where the POs and receipts are. So I'm going to pause here. Do you guys have any questions? I know, Hayden, this is kind of what you're doing similar in the inbound shipment, but instead you're actually receiving the PO to know that you've picked it up. And this is when you would do it. It'd be when you picked it up from the grower.
Gotcha. Yeah, I think one question that I have, and I may be getting ahead, but so we're currently working with a freight forwarder named Hillebrand. They're a long-running freight forwarding company,
Right.
and they have a great kind of portal that houses all of the data. And we're working to try and implement an API with our current inbound shipment section in NetSuite.
Right.
Because adding in all of this manual information every time that updates come through is just there's so much information and constantly fluctuating dates. So I think looking at this, is there possibilities of
there's possibilities, but from our experience with the inbound shipment, it's a little bit of an interesting record to program against, because it's not necessarily like made by the people who did the base NetSuite platform. I think it was a module that was bought and then NetSuite added into their offering. So it's gonna be the same approach, except we're using kind of like the core functionality that was built by NetSuite. So it's like, well, how do you create an item receipt? So it's like if Hillebrand said, hey, I've picked up these POs with these quantities, then you would call NetSuite and say, hey, I need you to look for these POs and create an item receipt with these quantities for this container. Yeah. So I mean, with any integration, it's like, how are they sending you the data? And then how are we reading the data? Prolecto has tools on how you can post data, and we have very skilled developers that have worked with APIs. So what we've done is we've assumed that things got picked up at the grower, and now we have these on the container, right? And then we know eventually the container is going to set sail. From a AP perspective, If we go ahead and look at the purchase orders now, they're in a state where you can use native NetSuite to be like, hey, I have a purchase order that's pending billing partially received. So now you can use NetSuite status to be like, okay, what are all the purchase orders that I need to pay? To answer Mark and Carolina's question, this kind of gives you, okay, well, I know that it's already, on a 5/7 date, or I know it's already been received on 5/7. That's when I know I need to start billing these. Does that make sense? Do you guys have any questions on that?
No, I mean, that makes sense to me. So essentially, whenever it's picked up, we'll be able to run a report or there'll be some type of export that we could run just to see anything that's pending billing.
Yep.
Bill it and just take it from there.
Yep.
Because I mean, for me, this is the proper way to do it. And it just, when I run a report every morning for the owner, basically breaking down all different metrics, I have to run a report every morning, piece together a bunch of different reports just to find out what's actually in transit. It's, it's pretty cumbersome. And I know just from an accounting standpoint, from a GAAP standpoint, the one is technically ours as soon as we pick it up. And just being able to put that on the balance sheet and always rely on inventory in transit would be a huge help for me.
So then basically you also know that this container is supposed to sail on 5/7. So once the container sets sail, you want to change the status to on sea in transit. So I'm going to hit save. If a user does this, you'll see that once you hit save, we usually have kind of a message up here. So this is kind of the queue I'm talking about. So we just send this request from a technical perspective to a queue, and then our scripts kind of process it. Before I even refresh it, I just want to show you, here are my containers. Here's my quantity. I have 0 shipped, 0 received. I think this is redundant. This is quantity in transit. So shipped and in transit are one and the same, but right now you see nothing's in transit. So I'm going to go ahead and refresh this record. Once it's done, you'll see the message goes away. And then now what you see is you have your quantity of shipping, your quantity in transit, right? And so this is the container shipping. So that's what you do in a container set sale. Hayden, you wouldn't need to work with the transfer order directly, but I'm just going to show you what happens in the background. So the goal is for you to kind of more or less interact with the container. But from a NetSuite like record perspective, we created the transfer order, and that's kind of the record that kind of helps us understand where we're moving inventory to and from. Once I moved it on sea in transit, it created an item fulfillment with the same date as the sailing date. I just wanted to show for the GL impact, because this I think it was Mark was interested in, is now you have things moved out of the overseas location, and now it's in transit to the final warehouse. So now you can say, okay, well, what do I have in transit to my final stock warehouse?
And that's all done automatically when you just.
That's all
when you
done
ship it.
automatically because NetSuite's when you hit on sea transit, because
Yeah.
basically we're using native NetSuite transfer order functionality,
Yeah.
and all our script is doing is creating an item fulfillment against it. And the item fulfillment, native NetSuite functionality is to move these into these accounts from in transit. Yeah.
And then essentially when you receive it, you would just update that status again. It would just push it into
Yes.
that balance location. Yeah.
Yep. So, so it's on sea in transit, and then eventually it arrives at the port. So basically, if you had integration, it could like update all these dates based on the status. So what happens, since you're only tracking the last stages, okay, it's on sea, eventually it gets to your warehouse. So then you just say, I'm going to receive it. I'm just going to show you there's one required field. So if I save it, it says, hey, you didn't enter the date, destination, actual. The reason why that's important is because that's what we use as the receive date. So even though we estimated 5/10, let's say it comes on 5/11, I'm going to hit save. Again, I haven't refreshed the record, but I just want to show you where we're at. We have quantity 50, or the quantity shipped, the quantity in transit. This is getting processed by the queue. Once I refresh and it finishes and that message goes away, now you see we have quantity, these received. But that's really the end of the process. And then if I wanted to show you the transfer order, if I refresh it, now we have an item receipt created against it with the 5/11 date you entered. And then here is just kind of the GL impact. Now it moves it from in transit to the final. Any questions on that, or any other comments or thoughts?
So is there like a dashboard view of all of these container informations that we can have by, a receipt date, by pickup date that would
Yeah,
show?
so you could do
homepage?
that. We customize it for each client. We have some base reports that every client, we've taken what their reporting requirements are, and we've displayed different. So here's like one report we did highlighting here. So it depends on what you want, but you'll see like these are certain containers. I don't know if it's color coded because of the status. right? Because here it's green because it's up there, and then everything else is red because you haven't received it. Like, hey, what kind of reports are you using today, or what kind of reports are you looking to have?
Yeah, so we're looking at incoming wines on a daily, weekly basis, putting it into several different forecasting documents for inventory as well as cash flow. I mean, again, the inbound shipment section is great. It's very similar to kind of what you showed me. It has all the data in a readable view there, but we have to export to Excel to manipulate the data and get it into a digestible view for what we're wanting to extract data. So I'm just curious if there's like how on the homepage we can see certain metrics.
Yeah, I think that's all customizable. So like if you went here, you could create like a save search, or what we've done too. Prolecto has a tool that, this is more technical because another way to get reports done and you get more power out of it is using SQL, or what is called NetSuite's SuiteQL, which is a way to actually get into like the database and pull data. And that way you can like merge data that might not even be related from like a record perspective. NetSuite's limited because you can only go like 2 levels down. If I wanted to port on a bill and then go to the item receipt and the purchase order, it wouldn't let me because it's only going to let me look at the item receipt that's linked to the bill. Anything is available. We have query tools. You could put a safe search on here. So it just depends on kind of the information that you're exactly looking for. Like just so I understand, what are some of the manipulations you're doing today?
We just have, graphs and charts that track our inventory levels based on current inventory, based on depletion, and then obviously incoming wines. So
Okay.
we're looking more and more to try and getting as much into NetSuite as possible. And James, stop me if this is, too far out there, but I just know that's something we're always trying to do as well, is get as much data into NetSuite and off of offline documents.
Yeah, I think a lot of it's just like NetSuite limitations,
Okay. Like, I don't know if you're familiar with SuiteQL and if you've worked with just SQL language, but that's also a powerful tool that we've been using with a lot of clients, because then you can query the database versus being limited what NetSuite's offering you on their Safe Search tool.
Mm.
So that's something, again, if you want to install the bundle, we can provision for you. And if you want to walk through, I can give it to you, but it will give you another powerful way to get at the data.